So just to reintroduce myself, my name is David Valdes. I'm a junior political science major at Morehouse College, and I'm a scholar activist with the Lowery Institute. And honestly, it's an honor to be in the presence of everyone today. I'm excited, and as everyone knows, this election is quite important. So the Lowery Institute is founded in 2001 and is a civic organization founded in the mission of Dr. Joseph and Evelyn Lowery. Now, these two giants dedicated their lives to ensuring that people from essentially all walks of life had access to their basic civil rights. For Dr. Lowery, the vote was sacred. He believed that it was a necessity for all people to vote every time in every election. This mandate has been transferred to all who work with the Lowery Institute. As a scholar activist of the Lowery Institute, we have focused this year on what would have been his 101st birthday and the 20th anniversary of the Lowery Institute to achieving that goal. Julia and I are working on a team with other students this year to promote civic engagement, and it is our goal to fulfill the legacy and charge of Dr. and Mrs. Lowery to encourage students to vote, to help them break the shackles, limitations, and the historical oppression of voter suppression. Today, Julia and I stand before you to give you a historical background. We are going to give you a roadmap that you can take into this election to make sure your vote counts. So I want to start off by kind of asking everyone a question, or I want everybody to consider a question. Why is it that a law such as SB 202 is so effective? To many, it's really no big deal. A few extra ID requirements, maybe just a little less days to vote. However, I want to tell you why bills such as SB 202 are effective. It's effective because it preys on political apathy. And we know political apathy is a really big issue in the US. There is too much political apathy. Imagine an individual that already doesn't have trust in the system, and now they have to wait longer in line, or even have a little less time to submit an absentee ballot. These obstacles can really minimize voter turnout, especially for people who, literally can't afford fiscally to complicate their lives. But how did we even get here? There's a history to everything. So I want to take everyone back all the way to the year 1732. In 1732, about 100 men traveled from England all the way to present-day Savannah, Georgia, to establish Georgia as a colony. Now, for context, this colony was totally ruled by what were called trustees, and they made all the decisions with really zero input from the colonists. In other words, the right to vote did not exist in Georgia. This caused a major issue because there was something the colonists demanded from their government. Colonists, more than anything, desired land and the ability to practice slavery. However, the government declined, didn't allow this, with the goal of essentially attempting to distinguish itself from the other colonies who were practicing slavery. But this didn't stop the colonists. The colonists continued to pressure the government. The colonists didn't even think their colony could survive without slavery. So we see that their yearn for democracy is tied to slavery. The demand to practice slavery intensified as the years went on. Trustees were bombarded with letters and petitions, and the people of Georgia wanted the trustees to listen to them. And eventually, the trustees did listen, making Georgia a slave colony in 1751. This was the first time democracy made a considerable expansion in Georgia. And, you know, though people did not vote, it was the first time the trustees gave in to the demands of the colonists. They got what they desired: land and the ability to practice slavery. Then, in 1752, just 1 year later, we see democracy continue to expand. In 1752, white men owning 500 acres of land or more could be elected and pass laws for the colony. So here we're witnessing a step up in democracy. But keep in mind that there is strong potential that many of the white men who are now eligible to run for office also probably practice slavery. So we see it is impossible to talk about US democracy without it being tied to the institution of slavery. Another aspect of pre-colonial Georgia I want to talk about is this. So, according to historians, the reason for even establishing these colonies was for religious freedom. However, Catholics were totally forbidden from Georgia. Why did I not learn this contradiction in history class? I left public education with the impression that religious freedom and the establishment of the colonies were interlinked. I was never taught this contradiction. So why did I just tell you a little bit about Georgia history? It's so that when we talk about issues of the present, they make sense because there's a history to everything. And that's a little bit about pre-colonial Georgia. Let's now travel to the year 1778. Now, 1778 is an important year, and it's because this is when Georgia received official statehood and participated in the first presidential election. Georgia casted its vote unanimously for George Washington, who happened to enslave over 100 people. So we got the most powerful position in American politics had an individual that believed the practice of slavery was healthy to the nation. And the great state of Georgia helped make this happen. Excuse that. And what's sad is that on paper, you would get the impression that Georgia and the US in general would not act this way. In joining the United States, there are two critical documents that are super foundational to the US. The first being the Declaration of Independence, which Georgia joined the US in signing in 1776. The Declaration of Independence essentially outlines our American government's philosophy, and it has quite profound words. Listen to this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Then it continues to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. There's one issue with this. When this document was written, all women, Black people, and economically disadvantaged people were, for the most part, totally barred from voting. So we see that what the US claims to be on paper was not matched by reality. Now let's get to the second foundational document. The second foundational document is, of course, the US Constitution. And really, we do not have to go too deep into the Constitution to find its contradictions. The first words of our Constitution state we the people. But we know that's incomplete. It would be more accurate if it stated, we the white rich men who have property. Now, let's now travel to the ending of the Civil War, where Reconstruction Amendments are introduced. The Reconstruction Amendments include the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Let's first examine the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but people tend to overlook a loophole in the 13th Amendment. There's an exception for involuntary servitude if the individual is convicted of a crime. That loophole is not okay. And then many formerly enslaved people return to work for the same person who enslaved them because there was no other option. So yes, the 13th Amendment had positive impacts, but we need to see the entirety of its impact. And when we do, we see it is more of a symbolic gesture rather than an effective policy. Let's now talk about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment seeks to provide equal protection of the law. Yet, over 150 Black people were murdered in what was called the Koflex Massacre. They were murdered by white Confederates, and not one was successfully prosecuted. You want to know what the court said? The court said the 14th Amendment did not apply. But was the 14th Amendment not supposed to provide equal protection of the law? Let's now go to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment promises that the right to vote will not be violated due to race. But as many of you know, this amendment fails to reach its true potential because literacy tests, poll taxes, and terrorism by groups such as the KKK stop the right to vote from being practiced. Why are we talking about this? We see how each time the rights, such as the right to vote, is expanded, it is met with a backlash that renders these amendments inefficient or incomplete. In the present, right now, we are witnessing a backlash. Laws passed in the Civil Rights Act are being repealed. But as I have attempted to show during this presentation, this is really nothing new. It is our history. So we went through this history to make sense of how we got to this situation where we're dealing with modern day voter suppression, such as bills such as SB 202. And though we are rightfully upset about the voting status quo, we need to remember people have died and sacrificed their entire lives to get us to where we are today. So it's important we vote.
Thank you, David. As we mentioned earlier, in the 1950s and 60s, leaders such as Dr. Joseph Lowery, Mrs. Evelyn Lowery, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and so many other brave men and women spearheaded the fight for equality among all people in the United States. The fight to abolish segregation, discrimination, and the disenfranchisement of Black and Brown voters would be known as the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement led to the passage of several federal laws. The federal law that we're going to talk about today is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Supreme Court case that overturned part of the law. This would be known as Shelby v. Holder. Now, first, we're going to talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act. So, the Voting Rights Act put Southern states on probation for their historical disenfranchisement of Black voters. What Section 4 did was determine which states would be subjected to Section 5. And of course, Georgia was included among these states. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required these states to obtain federal preclearance before implementing any changes to their voting laws or practices based on their history of voter discrimination. So before any of these states could pass any voting laws, it had to go through the government. The formula was set to expire in 1970, but Congress reauthorized the act several times, as recent as 2006. And 2006 was a very special time in our nation because in many of these states, Black and white voter registration was nearly equal. And Black voters were getting out and voting in very large numbers. So it was proof that the Voting Rights Act was doing some good in the United States. 2011 is where everything changes. In 2011, Shelby County, located in Alabama, sued the United States, stating that Section 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, and they asked for a permanent injunction. They argued that times had changed and that these southern states were not the same states that they were 40 years ago. The district court and the United States Courts of Appeals disagreed. They shut Shelby County down. They said that the Voting Rights Act was still necessary to fight voter discrimination. Shelby County did not back down. They decided to go to the Supreme Court. And on February 27th, 2013, the Supreme Court decided to hear both sides of the argument. So when they were listening to both sides of the argument, they had to consider a number of documents. Of course, they had to consider the Voting Rights Act. And as David mentioned, they had to also take account of the 14th and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, of course, protects everyone's right to due process. The 15th Amendment protects citizens from having their rights taken away based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. And the major one was the 10th Amendment, which reserves all rights not granted to the federal government to the states. So the big question that the Supreme Court had to decide was, did state and local governments still have to follow Section 5 and 4B of the Voting Rights Act? And on June 25th, 2013, the verdict was in. The Supreme Court voted no. In other words, the states did not have to get preclearance for voting laws. Now, the vote was very, very close. It was 5-4. And the majority claimed that the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because it was based on evidence of that was 40 years ago. So similar to what the Shelby County argued. And they were basically saying that, discrimination is over, everything's fine, everything's good, everything is equal. But Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she wrote an opposing opinion, arguing that while voter discrimination had decreased since the Voting Rights Act was passed, it was because of the Voting Rights Act, which protected all voters from discrimination. And she had a very, very powerful quote when she said, throwing out preclearance, when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes, is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. So it is arguable that the ruling has made it more difficult for people of color to vote. 5 years after the ruling, 1,000 polling places in the country have been closed. And most of these places have been in the Black community. So this is why we see longer wait times and longer lines. A 2020 study found that jurisdictions previously covered by preclearance increased their voter registration purges. So that means they're taking people off of the voter registration list and not notifying them. So if you've been registered since 1999 and you feel like you're fine You go to the polling place to vote on election day and they tell you you're not registered, that can have devastating consequences. So make sure that you check your voter registration status. And you can do so on feelgoodaction.org. So check them out to make sure you're registered. Since the ruling, states that were required to get pre-clearance have passed a significant amount of laws that have made it more challenging to vote, including the most recent restrictions in Georgia, SB 202 or Senate Bill 202. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Senate Bill 202 was adopted in Georgia in 2021. And as we remember, in 2020, Donald Trump, our president at the time, made accusations of voter fraud claims. So this has resulted in many states cracking down and creating restrictions under the guise of voter security. So that's what Senate Bill 202 was intended for. Now, Senate Bill 202 is a 95-page measure of the do's and don'ts of voting. And breaking any of these laws can result in a misdemeanor charge. So today we're going to talk about the big impacts mentioned in Senate Bill 202, which are absentee ballots, drop boxes, provisional ballots, mobile voting, and poll workers. So let's start off with absentee ballots. So prior to the passage of Senate Bill 202, signature verification was the primary means of checking voter identity. Now, after the bill has been passed, it is required that you have proper identification. So a driver's license, ID, or a college ID. However, if you go to a private university, such as Clark Atlanta, Morehouse, Spelman, you cannot use your ID. If you go to a state school or a public school like Georgia State, that is acceptable. Also, Georgia has now made it possible for people to get free IDs. So you can check your local county website to see where you can get those. And also inform any of your friends or people you're trying to get to vote. Okay, so now we're gonna go to drop boxes. So absentee ballot drop boxes were introduced in Georgia in 2020 during the pandemic. And they were located outdoors and they were under 24 hours surveillance. And people could just come in any time to drop off their drop boxes. And at the time, there were 38 absentee ballot drop boxes. Now there are only 8, and they are located inside of voter locations. So in order to drop off your absentee ballot, you must be there between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Moving on to provisional ballots. So provisional ballots are cast by voters who believe they are registered to vote, even though their names are not on the official registration list at the polling place. So before, there were no real stipulations over casting provisional ballots. Now, in order to cast a provisional ballot, you must have proof that you got to the wrong polling place after 5 p.m. So if you went to the one that you thought you were supposed to go to at like 4:55 and they tell you, no, you're at the wrong place, but the place is more than 5 minutes away, then your vote will be counted. So that's why it's very important just to get there early to avoid any delays or conflicts. And also if there's any lines as well. So get there early. Moving on to mobile voting. In 2020, Fulton County introduced mobile voting units to expand early voting. Now, we cannot vote by phone and we cannot vote online. Last but not least, poll workers. So this is actually a good thing. Before Senate Bill 202 was passed, residents of Fulton County, or whatever county that you lived in, was the voting place that you worked at. So you couldn't be from a different county. So if you're from Fulton, you had to be at Fulton. You couldn't go to Gwinnett. However, now, as long as there's no conflicting interest and you can complete your task effectively, you can work at any precinct. In conclusion, so let's go over some of the do's. So do have proper identification, state ID, driver's license, public university ID. If you're voting early, if you're voting in person, excuse me, make sure to get there early and make sure you're at the correct place. Request your absentee ballot at least 11 days before the election. We encourage you to request them as soon as possible in case there's any delays by mail so that you have your absentee ballot on time. You can drop your absentee ballots off indoors at the drop boxes in Georgia. Also, different absentee ballot deadlines differ based on whatever state you're voting in. So make sure you look at your state websites. And also you can volunteer as a poll worker at any precinct. The don'ts, you cannot use signature verification for absentee voting. You must have proper identification. You cannot use private college identification. You cannot hand out food or drink to voters. You also cannot wear candidate paraphernalia. So no Stacey Abrams t-shirts or Brian Kemp shirts or buttons or anything of that nature. And also you cannot vote online or by phone. And we're just gonna review some of the deadlines. Also our Kahoot covered these as well. Registration deadlines are October 11th, and that goes for mail, online, and also in-person voter registration. When it comes to absentee ballots in Georgia, these dates are specific to Georgia. You can request your ballot October 28th. You can return it by mail or drop box on election day, November 8th by 7 p.m. Early voting differs based on your county and precinct, but the big date that we all have to remember, if you're voting in person, if you're dropping off your absentee ballot, the big date is November 8th. And I'm gonna turn it back over to you, David.
Thank you, Julia. So we hope this information was informative and, come up with your voting plan, encourage others to vote, make sure to understand these voting laws. And just to end, we appreciate the presence of each of you, and we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.